Okay, just a general announcement. When you've got a question, wait for one of the roving mics to come up.
Super.
And then we can hear you and everything else. So what I suggest we do is start with questions from the floor for particular speakers. And since we got Vittorio loud and clear, anybody want to have a go at Vittorio?
Come on.
Come on, I know Klaus does, but come on. Klaus, maybe you go for the first question while everybody else is just getting one ready.
Okay, Vittorio, you can hear me, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was really interesting that now you also were talking about the embodied simulation account. So I'm very interested in clarifying the relationship between the mirroring mechanism and embodied simulation. So on some slides I had the impression that one is part of the other, and then on other slides you were talking about mirror mechanism fueled embodied simulation. So basically what I'm getting at to kick off the debate is basically I propose that there is embodied simulation possible without a mirror neuron system being involved. Do you disagree with that?
No. But first of all, I would like to express all my sympathy to Geoff Bird that for reason beyond my understanding has decided to devote a substantial part of his time investigating and challenging something that doesn't exist and that doesn't explain anything. So I would encourage him to move forward to some more interesting topic. Okay, that was the starting joke. To be more serious and coming to your question, as I tried to say in my presentation, I take the mirror mechanism to be one of the many possible instantiations of embodied simulation. So in a way, you have embodied simulation without mirroring. For example, when canonical neurons kick in, scotch, or to be more appropriate with the setting with your cup of tea, maybe it's too early for scotch. I don't know in Scotland, but maybe it's too early even there. You just don't see a shape, a three-dimensional shape, but the object evokes, automatically triggers, with the modulation of the context, of course, the motor potentialities that that very same object evokes. So that qualifies as an instantiation of embodied simulation. Looking at an object and automatically in the object seeing a potentiality for action. It's in a way similar to the notion put forward by Heidegger when he speaks of Zuhandenheit. So the object is ready at hand. It's not just the target of my mere contemplation, but can all of a sudden become the target of one out of many potential interaction I may want to entertain with that very same object. Similarly, when something moves around my face, someone is throwing a tomato to me at the end of my talk, and I do my best not to get it on my face. This is an example of a visual motor coordination. But even if I don't do anything, it will still be possible to monitor activation in my premotor cortex. And this has been proved at single neuron level in 4 in monkeys, Bremer and others show it by means of fMRI. So an auditory event, physical visual objects within my personal space, the activation, the simulation of a potential action I'm chart to the very same object. So these are also instantiation of body sensation that have to mirror neurons. So
a little bit. So this is why I switched off the video. Everyone in airplane mode? Okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, as I was saying, mirroring is just one instantiation of embodied simulation. You have embodied simulation also when your motor system reacts to auditory or visual stimuli in the vicinity of the body, or when you look at a manipulable object, even if you are not issuing any intention to do anything with that very same object. Also, this qualifies in terms of embodied simulation.
That is not part of the mirror neuron.
Exactly.
Okay, maybe further questions for Vittorio. I have one. I mean, sorry, you have a question? Yeah. You mentioned some neuropsychological evidence that those with premotor lesions may have problems with action understanding. But there's plenty of cases, and Rimiati has drawn attention to them, where you have patients with motor deficits and no comprehension problems, and the reciprocal, patients who don't understand actions but are perfectly capable of performing them. So the neuropsychology doesn't quite fit. You seem to be a bit selective in that, in choosing the cases to support the neuron theory. That's a mirror neuron theory. Can you reply about that?
I disagree. I disagree because, as I said, given the pervasiveness of this mechanism in wide sectors of the lateral surface of both hemispheres, in order to knock out entirely the system, you should damage a substantial part of the cortical convexity, first. Second, there are still many people believing that mesial areas support mind reading, in spite of the fact that you were among those demonstrating you can still be a competent mind reader even when bilaterally your mesial prefrontal cortex is destroyed. So, I mean, you can always pick arguments favoring or arguing against an hypothesis. The point is whether we genuinely want to understand what's going on, or if we simply do our best to destroy a model for the sake of doing.
Yeah, no, it's just nice to get the debate going. I think...
I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it.
I mean, Vittorio, your position is one of sort of getting rid of the...
You can do whatever you want. I mean, of course, we need challenges, and we need people guiding our research, pointing out the flaws. But to be honest, none of your arguments that you presented in your presentation, that unfortunately I couldn't follow entirely, but I could read the PDF. So as long as you didn't change the slides, I know exactly what you said. I'm just missing your prosody, but the content is clear to me. And by the way, I found rather interesting that you decided not to use what used to be one of the major examples that your group used to challenge the relevance of mirror mechanisms to explain anything, which is the paper by Catmore. Once that this paper has been clearly demonstrated not to support the claims it was support to support. So you change your target, but I mean.
Okay, so we have a question for Jeff to answer, I think, and maybe Jeff could provide the answer.
Hi, Vittorio. That was actually Dave that asked that question, not me, but I'll respond to yours. So I think the paper you're referring to is the Cattaneo and Gallese. And I think there's many flaws in that study, but even ignoring those. So just for everyone else's benefit, this was a study where... So Caroline Kaplan's got this very nice result where you can use TMS to examine mirror responses. So, for instance, she asked people to observe an a little finger movement like this, or an index finger movement like this, and use TMS to investigate muscle activity in the corresponding muscles. And Luciano Fadiga has got, he showed this first of all, that if you observe this action and you give TMS to primary motor cortex, you can see motor evoked potential that's larger in this muscle than if you observed this action. And Caroline's given counter-mirror training, and she's shown that that effect completely reverses. And Cattaneo and Barchiesi argued that actually this effect was not due to mirror neurons. So, for instance, they gave one group that was trained to mirror, one group was trained to counter-mirror, and they argued that the time course of the effects suggested that the counter-mirror effect was actually later. So, like I said, I think there's many things wrong with this study, but let's just go for the data they report and take it at face value. So the stimuli they used were not a replication of Caroline's. They've got a very big spatial compatibility confound. And so they did a control experiment. So they said, okay, let's make sure that we're actually measuring imitation response, not spatial compatibility. They did the control experiment, and you'd expect the results they found in the imitation, they wouldn't find in the spatial compatibility control experiment, so you'd expect an interaction. In fact, they found exactly the same results in the spatial compatibility control experiment and in the automatic imitation experiment. So they did a control to show their results were actually due to imitation, not spatial compatibility, but found exactly the same effects in the spatial compatibility control experiment. Like I say, I think there's a number of problems with their methods. So Caroline has actually just tried to follow up their experiment, correcting for those kind of design flaws, and she finds exactly the same pattern for mirror training and counter-mirror training. So, I mean, that paper, I think, is under review at the moment. But I think, if you don't kind of believe me about the flaws of the Cattaneo and Barchiesi, you just need to look at their control experiment, which showed exactly the same results as the other one. To me, it's clear.
Okay, so do you have a question?
I do.
It's dangerous.
At some point.
Okay. I don't know if this is working, but well, maybe we'll move on to questioning Jeff and as an ex-neurophysiologist, and we've got Vittorio here as closer to that. You made a very cogent criticism of the mirror neurons, that you could do the whole lot by association. You went on to say that, well, there's lots of different types of mirror neurons, and therefore they really can't help us understanding intentions and things. And perhaps I think your argument's weakening itself there, because if we went to the visual cortex, we would find cells that are very good for color discrimination, and other cells that might be very good for movement perception. But we wouldn't think of the color cells as being useless for telling us about, we wouldn't think, because we've got an array of different types of visual cells, that therefore the visual cortex doesn't help us understanding the visual world. My point is, all of the cells Vittorio has described in the premotor cortex have a lot of different specialisms. And why not use the relevant specialism? And that doesn't mean to say that the mirror neurons are useless for everything. You can have particular ones that are useful for particular intention understandings. My reply is, or point is, that specialism allows functionality. And if some cells are highly specialized for something, we shouldn't overlook them. I made a rather long point, but I'm really backing up the neurophysiology here. I'd like you to come back to that.
Sure. So if it sounded like I was saying that the range of actions means we can't use them to understand intention, that wasn't my message. My point was that the fact that we have all of these type of cells that respond to low-level properties, things like viewpoint, hand use, reach direction, stuff like that, means that they're not solely coding the intention of the executor of the action. So
it can be conditional. And if you want to understand the intentionality of this person as opposed to that person, we have to know that they're two different people. We have to know that they're different parts of space, different distances from us. So the conditionality of all of these cells helps us with build a bigger and better representation of actors in the world. So far from being useless to understanding intentionality, I think it might be, this richness of specificity helps.
I think there's a subtle distinction between I agree that having these type of cells gives us further information about what the other person's doing. That seems clear. But the point is that, if you watch me reach out to do this and to drink, and in one case I use my right hand, and in one case I use my left hand, for instance. My goal, however construed, whether to grasp the glass in order to drink, is exactly the same in both conditions. Mm-hmm. So if these cells were just coding the goal of the action, they should be active in both contexts. My point is just simply that that's not all they do. Potentially, because Rizzolatti and Sinigaglia argue that it's only the general ones that do action understanding. That's their quote, not mine. Mm-hmm. And my point is simply that if it's only the general ones, then actually, I don't think there's hardly any that are general.
Okay.
But they can definitely help us to understand the action.
Yeah, let's bring Natalie here.
Just on that point, actually, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just on that point, to complement what you said, if you want to go for a more predictive account, where you're not just predicting action goals, but where you could have predictions at multiple levels in a hierarchy, then I think what Dave just said makes a lot of sense, right? Because this differential coding of different populations of neurons could help you to make different predictions depending on what it is that you need at a particular moment. So I agree with you that if you want to talk just about understanding of action goals or intentions, then perhaps there's a problem. But if you want to assume a model where you make predictions at different levels, then I think this is indeed an advantage for the functionality.
We got Harold.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I think is interesting is that somehow I have the feeling that ASL and mirror neurons are very close connected. Well, now it seems, at least you managed to really make friends in Italy at the moment. But he could have taken up the message totally differently and would say, okay, actually what you are doing is showing us how mirror neurons can develop. And I think the big issue then is that he is stressing the fact that they are motor and you are stressing the fact that they are visuomotor or perceptual motor.
It's not the only difference.
And I think
Associative.
And if you would take this, then I think we are really talking only on the edges where you guys distinguish. But I think the real difference for me is that Vittorio is stressing the fact that mirror neurons are motor by nature, while you are stressing they are associative by nature. What would you say?
So to kind of respond to both of you, I don't think that is the only difference. So the Palmer group say that mirror neurons represent an adaptation for social cognition, an adaptation for action understanding. If they're built through association, they're not an adaptation for anything. And that doesn't mean you can't utilize them or recruit them to do stuff once they're there, but they're not an evolutionary adaptation for anything. And in terms of the prediction, so let's take the peripersonal and extrapersonal mirror neurons. So in both cases, you're observing the monkey reach up to grasp something. Now, whether you yourself can reach that object has no predictive ability for what that person's going to do. They can always reach it. What it obviously does predict is whether then you can reach out and steal it, for instance, as Vittorio said. So these things they coding the action context. They code in the joint action context, but they don't enable us to predict either the intention or the action of somebody else, because peripersonal, extrapersonal space refers to us as the observer. So it predicts whether we're going to reach out and grab it. It doesn't predict the behavior of the observer.
Yeah, we've got both Natalie and Harold giving us lots of conditionality about, I could call it mirroring, or I could call it using the actions of others to program actions of the self in some form. But both Harold and Natalie gave tons of instances where these were conditional on various things. So I think that either of you two should be picking up on this context, and I hope I'm arguing with Jeff on the matter. Maybe not. Maybe you want to agree.
I completely agree.
So is it too much of a consensus here then?
Okay, let's throw in another thing. So I think you're absolutely right that both Harold and I would sort of stress the fact that there's a lot of top-down modulation and that there's a lot of knowledge about the context and about the action possibilities that would constrain the simulation. But I want to throw in another constraint that we haven't talked about yet, and that has to do with the body schema. So in the stimulus-response association account, it seems to me that you're assuming sort of arbitrary link between stimuli and responses, and as long as you see something often enough, as long as you have high frequency, you should be able to learn it. But it seems that some associations are much more readily learned than others. One of the factors could, of course, be how easy it is for you to sort of map observed actions onto your own body schema. So a lot of people would believe that motor simulation is somehow mediated by similarity also in body structures. So maybe you could say something about how that account deals with that.
If I may just add one sentence to this. So we were just discussing like the facial imitation. So you see this adult face. How can you ever relate your own baby face to what the adult is doing? So just to make it a little bit more concrete and make it a little bit more harder for you.
So everybody's ganging up on me, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, to take everything in. So ASL doesn't... Associative learning encodes context. So you can take rats, you can teach them one stimulus response in a red cage, one stimulus response in a blue cage, and depending on which colour cage they're in, you'll get the different response cued by the same stimulus. And that seems to, for me, account for the fact that, context, top-down modulation can change the type of response that you do in response to a stimulus. In terms of Natalie's point, so I'm not really aware that there's any evidence that all other things being equal, some associations are easier to learn than others. Now, we know a number of things that influence associative learning. For instance, whether something's surprising, whether something's rewarding, how much attention we pay to the input, whether there's competing stuff in the world. And all of these things influence associative learning about anything. It doesn't have to be bodies or actions. And I think if you control for all of those things, I don't think there's any evidence that we can learn matching things quicker than non-matching, for instance. Was there something else? Oh yeah, sorry, Harold's point, the facial stuff. So Harold said, if we're a child, how can we map our face onto the adult's face? In an associative view, there is no need to map. There's just a stimulus and a response. You don't need to account for differences in the size of the face, the different weights. It's just, if you get correlated experience of seeing and doing the same thing, then you'll get a link. If you don't, you won't. You don't need to map different faces and stuff.
It seems that everybody gangs up against Jeff, but actually we've drifted into the first major topic that Simon and Klaus set us, and that was to think about the role of mirror neurons, or these associative neurons, if what we want to call them, in development. And you gave an excellent presentation review of the neonatal imitation. But I mean, I think nobody would disagree with the fact that these cells can't be used, aren't affected by learning. So we're probably all in agreement there. But I want to open it up, and given this topic we've been asked to think about, the role in evolution and development, what do the audience think on this particular issue, or the debatants? Anybody want to kick off on this?
What's the actual question, sir?
Well, I mean, we've given what are the roles of the mirror neurons in ontogenetic development or evolutionary development. I mean, your point. Okay. We have an.
Right. I'd like to make one point, maybe to Jeff, and just see what your response is. Well. Sorry. Well, we were asking about the developmental stuff, and you're the person who's talked most about that. So, in evolutionary terms, we'd clearly say that there isn't a bit of the brain which has evolved for reading, because that's not something innate, it's something we've learnt. But after we've learnt it, then there's clearly some stuff that responds pretty strongly to written words and shapes of letters and stuff like that. And if you knock that bit out, then you'd probably be pretty bad at reading. So can't neural systems, in a sense, be behaving in the same way? It's not that there's necessarily that something evolved for a specific function, but they can still be very useful to the adult. Would you agree with that, or would you argue against that? They can still be a very specific system.
So yeah, I think something like the visual word form area is a fantastic example. I mean, it can't have been laid down by evolution. We haven't been reading for long enough. But yeah, it's still the case that you get this dedicated brain area. So that's absolutely, definitely a good example. And the thing is, where they come from and what they do are completely orthogonal questions. They're not necessarily orthogonal if you take the idea that it's an evolutionary adaptation for, because whatever they were selected for is what they do. Under an associative count, it's completely different. So it's perfectly possible that they're learned and they do stuff. To be honest, I really haven't seen much evidence that they do stuff. So the system as a whole, the whole system, from kind of STS to inferior parietal to premotor cortex, I think is a great way of selecting relevant actions from external stimuli. Some of those may match, some of those may not match, some are object-based, some are space-based. The whole system is just about response selection. So the fact that a neuron which makes me grasp fires, it might grasp in response to the cup, in response to a spatial signal there, whatever. But they're not mirror neurons that's doing it. There's a motor neuron which is making me grasp, and many things can cue that. So mirror neurons themselves are not doing stuff. The system for visual motor control does it.
So I guess I agree with you on that, but then maybe Victoria's
where Italian job is no more.
He got furious, I think.
Well, I mean, going on for hold on. What did you bring you in? Because
I think
you've
so.
written on a situation with a task where you don't think it can be explained by associative.
But perhaps maybe I might follow up on your issue about the ontogeny of the mirror neurons. And I would say, like, the ASL is making it very easy because there are no rules. It's just any contingency will do it. Well, I think that for me, that's hard to believe. So people like Zebra have said, okay, there are 3 ways that we can learn very logically. We can learn by just observing somebody, we can learn by doing things ourselves, and we can learn by thinking. And then the debate starts, okay, what do you mean with thinking? And so the easiest one is, okay, what do you learn by doing things yourself? And I think we all kind of would agree that if you do something yourself, you get more information about the thing that happened than if you only observe it. And so then you can ask the question, what's the additional information that you get if you do something yourself? In ASL, this all doesn't exist. So it's just like, okay, there's an association between things that you see and things that you're doing yourself, and if they're just contingent, you learn the association. Well, I think that is like really like not sufficient to come up with a good model. You need to take into account, like Natalie's issue, like the importance about body schemas, etc. That's just, I think, otherwise you can say, yeah, any association will do it. So if I see a bird flying, oh, yeah, I can also fly, or something like this. But I can also go to the tree. I can also walk to the tree. And there's just a contingency of time. So you need to have constraints. It's not like, I mean, every time I'm outside and I see a tree, I see a bird flying to the tree. So how do I separate this? That, oh, I'm not a bird. So you see, you can make any kind of associations, but you need to separate them, and very likely a bird doesn't activate your motor system, so it's not activating your response. But it happens in time.
Natalie?
Just related to this, I think a sort of interesting puzzle in development is that children seem to sort of go from preferring perfect contingencies to preferring more imperfect contingencies. So you mentioned that in a lot of cultures, perhaps some cultural variation, but in a lot of cultures, you have this mimicry where the parents actually mimic the children, and that could be some important input. And I think that's really interesting and sort of an important ingredient. But then you also have this evidence suggesting that the children, quite early on, I think around 9 months or even earlier, sort of start preferring imperfect contingencies because they're socially much more interesting. So you like interacting with people who don't always mimic you. And I think there's a bit of a puzzle there in a way, right? I don't know if anybody has a comment.
So I'm not really sure there is a puzzle because the associative theory doesn't try and explain life or like the mind or how we behave or what we learn about or what we like. It's simply trying to explain how it can be the case that we receive patterns of light across our retina, which happens to correspond to somebody making an action. And even though this is patterns of light across the retina, it makes us perform a muscle command, which is associated with performing that action. Now, obviously, we're not rats, we're humans. And, if the task is set up so that we do something different rather than the same, then we'll do something different. If, our motivational system says don't imitate, we won't do it. Or if it says perform another action, we won't do it. The point is just that, if there is the link between observation of an action and doing of an action, then if you see that action, you're going to be more likely to perform that action. It doesn't mean that obviously that you're going to do it. Whether we prefer imperfect contingencies or not, especially at 9 months, I don't think really impacts on whether the link between observed and executed actions is built on associative learning. I think it's a different question. And ASL doesn't try and explain everything.
Okay, we got a question from the audience. Hang on, just okay.
So I'm pretty persuaded by Jeff's position, despite everybody else's arguing against him. But I wanted to just ask for clarification on what you mean by the logically related, just clarification on the logically related mirror neuron, because you said later in your talk that they trick you, and I wasn't getting that. Yeah,
so what a logically related neuron actually is, it's a neuron that fires, for instance, when I do this. So I perform a grasp and, for instance, bring it to my mouth to drink. So that's what it fires for when you execute an action. But the action it fires for when you observe is this. So it's a completely opposite action, basically. And they're a specific match. Now, the idea is that if mirror neurons allow you to understand the goals or actions of other people, then logically related mirror neurons are a real problem, because they fire when someone does this action. And if they code intentions, they fire for the intention of, I don't want this, I'm putting it down. Now, they fire for execution when you do want it and pick it up. So there's a complete mismatch between the observed and the executed action, and between the observed and the executed intention. So if mirror neurons allow you to match because they put you in the same state, because they fire to a similar action, logically related mirror neurons, probably about 30% of mirror neurons, they're completely dissimilar states, they're completely opposite. So if the function of mirror neurons depends on putting you in the same state, firing for a similar action, then they're going to mess you up. Logically related mirror neurons are going to cause you problems.
Okay, yeah, Sam?
In the back.
Can you wait for the mic? Yeah, okay.
I have a theoretical question, I guess, in that, and I guess it's for everyone, it's that, I mean, if you go back to Lashley, it's all about hierarchies, and it isn't really sequential planning, and those were the arguments against behaviorists that this were associative chains. So if it is hierarchical planning of actions, I don't see either side really addressing that we have to deal with complex hierarchies. I mean, in all these experiments, it's usually, and it's just by nature to get some closure on your experiment, you need one action. You can't have these complicated hierarchies of actions in the kinds of experiments they do. But I just wonder, theoretically, how do the two different sides build up these action hierarchies, both for producing actions as well as for perceiving them?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging question, and we also discussed it in our group, since indeed we also discovered Leslie lately, and I think he was really the one to make this point already against behaviorism. And so one way out would be to take the predictive coding framework of Friston and Kilner and then say, okay, so the hierarchy is always at the highest level in terms of distal events. So you anticipate, so one way out would be to say it's only about sensory consequences, like the ideomotor theory, basically. And so you predict at the highest level. So if you want to engage with somebody else, you don't care so much about the specific movements, as long as you know what you need to do. Actually, that's probably the highest level, depending on his or her action. And so the hierarchy will be like the sensory consequences that you see in the world, and what are the highest ones. And that's and the hierarchy goes down, like the lower ones might help you to get to the higher ones. But so the hierarchy will be in terms of sensory consequences. That would be Friston's answer, and it's an easy way out. I'm not sure. It's very tempting to follow him. He's really throwing away the whole motor cortex. So he would say our motor system is steered by this. So we don't need to even to think about how we get to our response, because the sensory consequence in the world will also select the responses that come with it. And then you are there. Then you don't need to think about sensory input and your own motor response. Now also your own motor response is steered by the sensory consequences that you perceive in the world.
So then that takes you back to ideomotor theory?
Let's take you back to ideomotor.
Just to add to that, I think that is actually quite an elegant solution. So this is ideomotor theory, also common coding. And I think there is good evidence for individual action planning, that you're indeed planning your actions with respect to distal effects. For instance, you can get people to perform very difficult, unusual hand movements that they could normally never do if you give them some kind of perceptual consequence that's easy for them to produce. So I think actually, indeed, if you want to sort of argue that there is a commonality in perceived actions and performed actions at a perceptual level, it will solve some problems. However, what I'm always worried about is that this seems to work much better in some domains than others. So in the auditory domain, this works beautifully, right? So if I play the piano, I hear myself, and if you play the piano, I hear the same tones, and therefore hearing your piano playing activates my motor program. It works perfectly. But as soon as you go, for instance, to the visual domain, I think we have all these, difficulties with different perspectives and all kinds of things that come in there. So yeah, I don't know how much in the end can be accounted for by that.
I'm not too sure it is problematic. So I would say that ASL and ideomotor theory and predictive coding, in essence, are all the same thing. So ASL describes how the system is made. Ideomotor theory describes like the functioning system, and predictive coding is the control of that system. So if you argue that both the motor system and the visual system have multiple levels of coding, from a low level kind of kinematics to a higher level intentions, goals, and I think Dave's shown some of the same stuff in the STS, for instance, then as long as you have contingencies at any one of those levels, then you get things like broadly congruent mirror neurons, for instance, that might explain why you can mirror the broad goal of an action. They might explain strictly congruent mirror neurons, which might explain why you need to observe the same kinematics of action, for instance. They might even explain the very subtle effects which are muscle specific. So as long as both systems are hierarchical, depending on where the links are formed, then I think you can match at a high level or a low level.
Andy, you were raising your hand?
Yeah,
well, you got the floor.
Going back a bit, I suppose it seems to me that there's at least two main issues you've got running here. One is to do with kind of ontogeny of the system, and could it be created by association learning, or what had to be innate, basically, on the one hand. And then you were also asking the question, the first question on the list, I think, about what's the function of the system. I guess I've got questions of both, and I think they do actually intersect. But is Vittorio still with us?
No.
Oh, well, my question. My question
anyway,
was really for him.
Might pick it up.
Well, I guess. Okay, well, the question would have been for him. I mean, obviously, Jeff Bird gave a very, very spirited argument for the associationist story. And so I was interested to know, well, what's the position of Palmer, Gallese and that group now on that issue? Because I think, okay. So my question is really about imitation, which is one of my pet subjects, of course. And I think when mirror neurons were first discovered, everyone's first thought really ought to have been, well, obviously, if they've got a function, it surely must be for imitation. I mean, kind of that's what they're almost, God sent to do. But the Palmer group put that aside because one thing I think they didn't really see their monkeys imitating much, and there was other evidence around failing to demonstrate imitation in monkeys as opposed to perhaps apes and children and so on. And so they set that aside and have built this alternative theory of it's all to do with understanding others' goals and understanding others' actions in other ways. But since then, there has been much more research demonstrating imitation. In fact, Jeff Bird mentioned some of the bird work, for example, and there's quite a lot of our primate research is doing that as well. And it's from Palmer, really, Pierre Ferrari, who's been producing this neonatal imitation work. So I was really wondering, what is the Palmer position on that? Would they? Oh, and also there's work of Iacoboni and others on humans, where imitation really does come out as argued to be one of the main functions that mirror neurons subserve. So I'm interested to know what.
Perhaps I can react to that question. Since I started to study imitation, so it was really my field. But then after some time, there was also with discussions with Günther and Natalie. To me, it somehow strikes me that why should we have a system specially dedicated for imitation? It makes much more sense that we have a system that enables us to couple perception and action. And like Natalie is now really focusing on joint action. And is this a different system than the imitation one? That seems very unlikely to me. So I think the system there is very likely to help us to couple perceptual understanding or perceptual understanding for recognition of what somebody else is doing and what you need to do yourself. And it can be imitation in one circumstance, but it can be joint action in another one. But to me, and we also had these papers indeed kind of indicating that there's even more mirror activity if you do the opposite than if you do the imitation. So yeah, I tend not to believe that the system is functionally designed for imitation.
But not serving that, as it were. That was kind of ruled out in the monkey work.
No, okay, so this argument that they don't imitate, I think that's not so relevant. It's probably wrong and also irrelevant, but I would just see it as broader.
Yeah, maybe Klaus wants to.
Just picking up on Vittorio's, I was thought that he presented something new, at least to me it was new, so this kind of going beyond the mirroring mechanism and talking about embodied simulation. So I think this is, so the position has changed, at least in the last few years in a way, and I think this embodied simulation kind of approach will be much easier also to encompass imitation. It lends itself to it, so you simulate others, you simulate your own movements, and will lend itself very easily to provide an account for imitation. So I think the position will change, but Vittorio watching this video back might hate me for it. I don't know.
Can I just jump in quickly? So I think the original data, one of the original pieces of data that they said, shows that mirror neurons don't do imitation was they didn't find any mirror neurons in M1. I mean, there's at least 3 studies now that finds actually quite a lot of mirror neurons in M1. And there's, like you said, lots of human data that suggests. The other piece of evidence that they said was that they didn't see any EMG activity when monkeys were watching actions. I mean, the point is you don't see that in humans either, unless you give a TMS pulse to M1. You need to ramp up the system. So, I mean, I would probably guess now that they would be happy to say that they would relate to imitation. I would guess, because I think the evidence is really strong that they are. But that doesn't mean their function is to do.
Yeah.
I realise you didn't say that.
Yeah, I mean, the question, if you still got the microphone down there, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to kind of develop some of the things that have just been talked about in terms of the evolutionary drivers for any of these systems and whether they're separate systems or not. So even if the mirror system is not itself the adaptive consequence of the need for an imitation mechanism or a need for the prediction of others' actions mechanism, something in the brain has to be, because those are the 2 things that humans are fantastically better than our nearest ape relatives at doing. Other animals can predict other intentions, they can imitate. We are much, much better at doing those 2 things. So if it's not the mirroring system that everyone has been talking about, what else is it in the brain that is subserving those functions and is the thing that has evolved over the last million years?
Well, maybe Harold should speak to that, because, I mean, Harold gave this excellent presentation where we look at the mirror neurons and then we look at another system, a hierarchically organized one, which is more conceptual and the conceptual imitation. I don't know, these are parts of the brains that I didn't know about and I should know, so maybe you could deal with that.
So indeed, I think the wisdom comes from it that we don't do the same thing all the time. We can do so, and we can also then, so like if you are a ballerina, you are trained to watch the movements. So we can really focus on detailed movement kinematics, and then we can try to learn this. So indeed, I would say that the thing that we can, that might differ from other animals is that we have these prior things that we can modulate our inputs. And I think that is really helpful, and we can use this for imitation, but we can also use this not to imitate. And so, and there the medial areas in the brain are likely candidates, so we have access from our memory. That's basically what we do. So we have access of our memory, and Jeff is only talking about associative memory, and I would say, well, on top of that, we also have something like more functional, conceptual knowledge. And this is what we use all the time, and this makes us really good in many things.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question over here.
Well, this is really speaking to the question that you just asked, if I'm allowed to do that with some data from my lab showing how imitation responses are being implemented in mirror neuron systems, but those systems are being heavily modulated by top-down signals in the same kind of way that Howard's talking about, that depend on things like the social context and the social cues you're getting. And that's coming from things like areas, medial prefrontal cortex, areas associated with theory of mind. So it might be those top-down signals that are different rather than the basic visual motor stream.
If I may add one sentence to Antonia's, it's not only about visual context, that's the thing. It's not like the examples that Jeff is always coming like, oh yeah, you're in a red cave or you're in a blue cave. It's not only that. It's really what you want to see. And that's, I think that's really where we kind of differ.
Yeah. Subtle aspects of the social shows.
Maybe
social
Natalie gets
disagree to disagree.
Okay, I'll try to steer us in a slightly different direction. So on the evolutionary question, perhaps one further ingredient to consider is, at least some people like Tomasello would argue, that we have a special motivation to imitate others and to do things with others. So I think there's a real question as to, do you just want to focus on the sort of functionality of the system in terms of what it can do, or do you want to also postulate that there is some kind of motivational difference that can partly explain differences between humans and other species?
I mean, this was very salient in Jeff's review, that others seem to spend an inordinate amount of time mimicking and reinforcing imitation. And that's something that I've intuitively felt, but I've never seen the science for it. But we may need to think about the interplay between imitation being pleasurable and going the other way, that we might reinforce. So there's this bidirectional encouragement of imitation in humans. One can postulate, I mean, if you find it socially reinforcing, we're going to do a lot more of it. So maybe Jeff could speak, because you know the studies.
Yeah, completely. So I mean, it seems to be that, yes, I agree with Harold, there's probably loads of other stuff that determines, whether we imitate at a particular point in time. And, as Dave said, there's lots of cultural factors that makes humans very good at it. The fact that we're imitated the whole time, the fact that we've got mirrors, for instance, and we use them. But I think
we enjoy it.
That I think is what I'd slightly disagree with.
Okay.
So yes, I think
Mr. Disagreement.
I hate agreeing with anybody about anything. So it's true. There's been lots of social psychology stuff which shows that yes, we enjoy being imitated, and when we imitate others, they like us more. When we like other people more, we imitate more. Absolutely true. I think I'd say two things. One, I think there is a lot of situations where imitation is actually very bad and we hate it. So for instance, if someone takes a very dominant position towards us, we take a very submissive position towards them. And if we're submissive, they're dominant. We have this kind of interplay, and that's not imitative, but that's also rewarding, that's also pro-social. That does all the things that imitation does, but it's not imitation. Yeah. Okay. And I think there's some really nice experiments by Caroline Katmer, which I can't remember if they're published or not. So she's taken a lot of the kind of social psychology literature, which says, if you imitate somebody, they like you more. And she's shown that if you do contingent action, then you get exactly the same effects. So it might not be the fact that the actions are similar, it might be the fact that they're contingent that explains some of the results.
Yeah, I mean, these two set us a number of questions, and one of the major issues that we were asked to think about was this complementarity or mirroring, and it's something we've been dealing with in this conversation. And I mean, but we saw from Harold's presentation how the conceptual level, this is straying actually into a further area, but this conceptual level of understanding somebody else's goal before we might engage our motor imitation. But we could take a Birdian view of this level too, and association and experience could gain us this conceptual level. So there's a lovely experiment by Nikki Clayton and Nathan Emery about it takes a thief to know a thief. They showed that birds will cache nuts so that others can't find it, but only if they've stolen nuts. And you've got this thing that you might have to have the experience in order to get the higher level representation of others' intentionality. So I'm just sort of trying to generalize the Birdian association view, in this case of
Hazian.
Hazian. But I digress. Do we have different questions coming in from the audience? Yeah. Justin, we get him a mic.
Yeah, I just want to make the point or ask the question. You talk about a lot of actions being complementary to one another. We frequently like to do, and you might call dances, you might talk about fighting, but they're all learned. They're all sequences which we learn through culture. So the actual nature of the complementarity, the way that we respond to somebody else's action, we learn how to respond to somebody else's action by watching them and by watching other people in interactions. Throughout early development, that's a key developmental process. So isn't that part of imitation also?
well, specifically Natalie's presentation, where watching a couple dance might enable individuals to learn the role within the dance with another. I mean, so I think, yes, one would generalize across this. I mean, Natalie could speak to that. But
Yeah,
there's a further thing here. I mean, you might have to identify with the others, or find them part of an in-group, or find them somebody that you would find pleasant to emulate or imitate. So we haven't yet dealt with the affect associated with those with which you might want to do something complementary or mimic.
So on your last point, actually, you're absolutely right that this is, of course, crucial. So there's actually results showing that your implicit attitudes towards a group play a huge role. And we've actually done our study with people in the Netherlands seeing hands that they believed to be Moroccan. So they thought these hands belonged to Moroccan people, and then the effect goes away. Whereas if you show the same hands, same color, but you tell people that they belong to people from Suriname who tend to be more integrated in society, the effect comes back again. So these are very strong top-down modulations, but in a sense, they're only showing us that the system is quite sort of malleable and very sensitive to top-down influences, but it doesn't really tell us about the underlying mechanism of the sort of group-to-group mapping itself. With respect to development and imitation, I guess the question is, do you want to treat...
Just react on your example.
Yeah.
Like, so for me, it's like the question, like, so Jeff would explain this example, like, you have different associations between the two groups. Well, I would say it's more at an abstract level. So somehow, some group you like and the other one you don't like, and therefore you modulate the effect. And that's indeed the question, how is it modulating?
Sorry, just one more thing that I thought during your question. So I think the question is, do you want to conceptualize imitation as a special case of joint action, or do you want to do it the other way around? Yeah, exactly. But I definitely agree that there is a very close relation. And in fact, what children are initially not very good at and what they need to learn is turn-taking. Yeah. So I think they're sort of able to copy somebody before they get the timing right. So in a lot of the joint actions that you see in 2-year-olds, the problem is that they're doing their part but not at the right time. So what they need to learn is this kind of getting the temporal coordination right with other people. And you often see adults scaffolding them so they come in at the right time because the children themselves couldn't do that.
I think it's quite weird that you've got 3 people who all agree that complementary actions utilise exactly the same system as imitation. I mean, I think your point was perfect. You know, whether you call it imitation, I mean, to me, imitation is doing the same thing, so it's not imitation. But there's nothing functionally different about it. You know, in one case, you've got a link between seeing hand close and doing hand close, and one it's hand close and doing hand open. But the system's exactly the same. And I think probably most people wouldn't agree with that, but it just happens that all 3 of us do. But I think one thing that, just respond to Harold because he's always having a dig at me. So I would say that the context of what the group is, whether they're in group or out group, does activate different associations. And context can be internal, so you can give people tranquilizers and teach them association, and test them when they're not on tranquilizers, and you can show a decrement in learning. So context doesn't have to be external; it can be internal as well. It can be an attitude. It can be a pro-social point of view, for instance. But it's also the case that obviously we also do have other systems. Like I said, we're not just rats. And our behaviour is influenced by a number of things, whether we feel a threat, for instance, how much attention we pay to a stimulus, whether we allow ourselves to be influenced by kind of automatic stuff. So all of these things combine in order to determine, whether we mimic, whether we counter-mimic, or whether we don't do anything at all when we see actions. It's a complicated system.
Yep. Wait a second.
I'm surely the point here, I mean, you keep talking about actions matching with each other or not matching with them, and surely the key nature of the system is about recognizing similarities and differences, and the amount of difference, and being able to quantify that, and how much one action that you already have encoded is similar to, but different from another action. Because the way that we learn action, whether you're learning to ice skate, whether you're learning as a toddler, or any sort of skill, it's about how you iterate, you learn and you modify your existing action repertoire until it becomes an approximation of that which you're observing. So it's always about self-other matching within a comparable way, rather than an absolute set of differences or not differences.
Okay, well, I'd like to move to a third topic that our organisers suggested, and that's the extent to which simulation in general is going to engage the system that we're talking about, associative or mirror neuron. And maybe I'll start by asking Klaus to give a specific example of situations where simulation might be quite different. You maybe the instance with the chair, I think, was a good one.
Yeah. So being put here on the spot.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's fine. So we did an experiment on perspective taking. So to give it away right away is like what we found out is basically for putting yourself into someone else's point of view, we found that actually you're using a sort of simulation. It could involve action, but you could also simulate basically the sensory motor outcomes. So it's a bit unclear whether it involves the action system, but the sensory motor system should be somehow part of it, so the body schema, as we have mentioned before. Now, the interesting bit is that the same mechanism seems to be applied, disregarding actually what the goal, so to say, for this mental simulation is, whether you want to put yourself in a different abstract point of view, for instance, imagining myself sitting in a chair, or imagining being another person, like, for instance, Justice. So I could imagine embodying his posture mentally. Well, I could also try, but that will, of course, fail, to imagine his mental states. So basically, there are different types of putting yourself into a different point of view, putting yourself into someone else's body, and putting yourself into someone else's mind. But the stage of actually getting there, whatever happens then, once you're there, might be different. But to get there is actually essentially the same kind of thing, which involves this kind of a sensory motor simulation. We found it out by simply changing the posture. So for instance, if I put my posture like that, it's harder for me than if I already align myself towards you. So basically, my visual input doesn't change. It's just the posture. So basically, the proprioception changes. And this dramatically affects these sort of response times. And where are we getting here? So basically, we ask this question, is like, okay, is the mirror neuron an integral part of this? Yeah? Do we need a mirror neuron system for this sort of processes? Or is it stuff like an embodied simulation, like Vittorio actually now acknowledges, which was a bit new to me for that very reason? Or is it something completely independent of the mirror neuron system? Just one final bit before I pass it on. It's like in one experiment, we also had the avatar in the scene changing posture as well. So you had this element of direct matching and resonance, but it was independent. It did not interact with this kind of mental simulation process. So it seemed to happen at the end. So you could actually, so participants seemed to held back this kind of a direct matching process, so similar to what people were saying, yeah, so that actually there's a lot of top-down modulation, and the matching actually was only beneficial or hampering, depending on congruent, incongruent, at the end of the mental simulation. So you could postpone until the end, and then it mattered. So, which seems, A, that the simulation process did not directly depend on the resonance mechanism, supposedly the mirror neuron system, and B, it also underpins that we're actually really rotating large parts of our body schema. Okay, so far, so this is why...
Yeah, do you want to shape that into a kind of a challenge to one of the debatants?
To all of them, but basically, I was counting on Vittorio to disagree with that one, but he seems to be anticipating already that the debate would be quite hard on him. Sorry?
What's the difference between a mirror mechanism and embodied cognition?
He was saying so that basically... Yeah. So that what we do. This is why I asked him initially. This sort of question is like, what is the relationship between the mirroring mechanism and the embodied simulation? And he said, a little bit to my surprise, it's like, there are a lot of embodied simulations that do not necessitate a mirror neuron system. He was giving examples, for instance, imagining all sorts of stuff. So imagining actions or seeing an object and having the action already available, what you could do with it.
But I don't understand how that's embodied simulation. So if it's a canonical neuron, if I see this object, it activates some kind of motor plan for interacting with
Geoff, I know you want to argue all the time.
No,
but the point is, I would not like to argue Vittorio's position here, you know. So he's not here, so I don't want to defend his position, so it's more my position. Is basically this sort of sensory motor simulation. Does it depend on the mirror system, yes or not? So I say no, but does anyone disagree with that?
Well, you could, so I already mentioned the name Barstow. So Barstow is always coming up with visual examples. So clearly not mirror examples. So if you see an object indeed you kind of simulate what you can do with the object in your visual cortex. So, and he's calling it a perceptual symbol. So you have a symbol of what you can do with it. And I think one of the interesting questions is really about the format. So is it perceptual, is it motor, is it sensory motor? That's one of the really essential issues that we need to find out. And then my question is like, okay, and this conceptual knowledge, if this even is giving some top-down direction to it, is it then still using the same format? Or is it indeed also represented in a different format? That I think are really challenging questions.
I'm not sure it needs to be
Not for
either
Jeff,
or.
though.
No. Celia calls it shooting from the hip, speaking before you've thought. So this is a question for Natalie's stuff as well. So I'm not sure it needs to be either or. So for instance, in your example of seeing the dart, for instance, thrown, presumably you can make a kind of visual prediction. So you can kind of look at the angle of the dart and stuff like that, and how fast it's moving and work out where it's going to land. There may be some motor contribution, there may be some conceptual contribution, and potentially they all come together. So, I mean, maybe we run all three simulations at once, maybe.
I think that's a very good point, because we know, in fact, that people can use both visual expertise and motor expertise. And there are some studies where people have tried to sort of get a sense of how important these different contributions are. So, for instance, Maggie Schiffer has done stuff where you see a recording of yourself or a friend or a stranger, and you have to identify these people. And of course, for yourself, the idea is you never see yourself from behind, for instance. So you have to use motor experience. But for a friend, you only have visual experience. And what they found is that you have a contribution of both, but the motor one tends to be stronger than the visual one. And I agree that, I think more generally people use whatever they have available, right? So if you see some kind of object moving through this room and it shares some features with human motion, let's say it obeys, I don't know, the 2/3 power law or whatever, then of course you'll start, it will trigger some kind of motor programs, and you'll start making predictions based on your own action system. But if it moves in a really unnatural way that's completely different from your movements, you'll have to have a different way of doing it. And then the question is, I guess, for these situations where it's not obvious that you can use your own motor programs, how do you then do things? Is it then sort of done in a completely disembodied way? Or is there still some kind of sensory motor foundations? And I guess that's also where the Barcelona stuff is really interesting. So the idea is we have concepts, but a lot of them seem to have some kind of sensory motor grounding. So you think of a dog and you immediately have some association with what it feels like to touch the dog or what the dog smells like and so on. But I think your question was really more about different kinds of mental simulation, right? So how do we read, do we need mirroring to read somebody else's mental state? Something
well, that
right?
would be in the extreme, and I would think there are a lot of necessary steps. But we will get to theory of mind in a second. Yeah. So basically, I don't think that this automatic resonance mechanism actually can explain in any way.
Even Vittorio was very modest on that.
Disappointingly, so it's a debate.
Yeah, you're taking a complex issue like the conceptual level, but one can bring it down to straightforward motor stuff that you don't have. We discussed earlier, a bird flying into a tree. It's possible as an exercise to the audience. Can you imagine having a tail? Can you imagine your monkey with a tail and what you could do with it? Can you imagine having wings and what you would do with this? Peter Brugger used to ask this question, and it's a very interesting one, because if you can imagine, how? You don't have wings, you don't have a tail, but could you imagine using it? So it's a nice challenge. My tail's just sort of banging him on the head.
You have a large one.
Oh, that was a good one.
It's good we're coming to the end of this debate.
How can we do this? Because we don't have the motor apparatus. And Peter goes further, because he will, look at individuals that have been born without a limb, and then look for representations of, looking at in functional brain scans to see what gets activated when they see some other parts. Sorry, I haven't put the last bit very well, but the question is, how do we imagine an effector system which we don't have?
But perhaps before we go to the higher levels, which I think we definitely should do, there's one issue that we discuss a lot, particularly in our baby group. And in the beginning, things were easy. Like the Calvo Marino example was like showing, like, if you're an expert, you simulate more. Yeah. So if you're a ballerina, you have more activation if you look at ballet than if you are a capoeira dancer. But actually, this is very crazy if you think about it. And I think now, if you now overview all the the results, it seems to be the opposite. Because if you're an expert in something, and it's like Susan Beelock is having some nice examples, if you see a door handle, you see that all the time. So you don't get a lot of activation if you see something like a very daily used object. Because no, you just see it and you're ready, oh yeah, that's what I can do with it. So, this is like already at the,
this is the problem in all brain imaging. I mean, if you don't need to work hard, do you need to use that brain system a lot? And it's very difficult to predict whether you're going to get hyperactivation or hypoactivation, just under the same thing. I mean, that's a problem for the images, and you're included in this lot.
Yes.
So I mean, you get a very striking example, is if the mirror neuron system, the premotor system, only really lit up when there was a conceptual
it's relatively, that's relatively, of course.
Okay,
yes,
so, but I mean...
It was, the contrast is only there.
Making a story, of course. If we don't understand what's going on, we might have to engage all of our mental abilities harder to try and simulating what somebody's actually doing would help there.
But so actually I wanted to make the bridge to your question. Actually we have some EEG evidence also for this, is that if you can do things yourself in more or less a similar way, you probably expect less activation. So if you see something, if you need to think about a tail, so probably you get a lot of motor activation, because you still want to use your body to imagine the tail. So that's my prediction. And actually we did something with language, and then what did we do? So
man with too many experiments.
Too many people in the lab. So you read a sentence like the child is swimming or the dog is swimming, and you get more motor activation if you read the sentence the dog is swimming. And so very systematically, this paper has been published. So actually, and so the thing is that it's a bad example. The fish is swimming. And so, like, the fish is swimming, we can really simulate how a fish is doing it, although it's doing it in a different way. Well, if you say, like, the person is swimming, it can be any kind of swimming. So the thing that we try to control for, it's really like how precise can you activate your motor system, and it seems to be that you do this more if you read about animals doing things than if you read about yourself. But you can
maybe the number of degrees of freedom that the fish swing.
We did a lot of things to try to control. A lot of arguments, but the thing is, like, if you go to the higher things, I would make a point that you actually use more sensory motor simulations, because you don't understand the concept by itself, so you need to actually simulate it.
Okay, we're bickering amongst ourselves. We've got a question from the audience.
Yeah, just to add to your point, I mean, it seems to be very common for children to dream that they are flying. Yeah. So that's a simulation.
Yeah. And my point is, then you will find a lot of sensory motor activation while they're doing this.
But I've got a question in this context also, specifically also for Natalie, because we seem to be equating implicitly here that if we get sensory motor activation, that the mirror neuron systems is automatically part of it, or that some resonance mechanism active. Especially in your talk, I had the impression that when you were talking, simulating the other, in a way, was it intentional that so automatically you would relate it to the mirror neuron system? And no, not necessarily, but just the CNV. What's the topography exactly? Do you have any information about the sources of in the brain?
Actually, so for that particular one, we did a source analysis, and we get a cerebellar source, which makes lots of sense, because if you talk about sort of temporal predictions, it could be that the cerebellum has a really crucial role. So I think in general, I'm much more interested in sort of the functional properties of a perception action matching system. So I don't really care whether, as one person is trying to make a prediction about the other person's actions, whether you get mirror neuron activity or not. For me, it's more about, do we have evidence for a functional principle where perception and action are sort of really closely intertwined? And I think often we just don't have the evidence to make any sort of, direct claims about the underlying neurophysiology.
You touched on the CNV, and you showed the data that showed that the CNV was earlier when there was a cooperative act and that you might depend on the other. But I mean, having worked in the motor system some time ago, or the cortex system, anything that's predictive gets locked onto. And you could say in a situation, you want to start getting your own motor programs ready, then you'll use the earliest predictor possible, and necessarily that will go to the other person when that person is initiating the act. So I wasn't at all surprised that the CNV should shift to the earliest possible predictor, because that's if you're getting any motor system ready, you just have to do that. And it just kind of, it's a logical thing to do. It was very nice to see, but it's just what you'd need. Go for the earliest predictor.
Right. So you're basically saying this is sort of very egocentric in a way. You're just trying to optimize your own action.
If a monkey's readying to reach out and grab something at the earliest possible opportunity, you can say, okay, tone means go now.
Right.
Or you can have a little light that says tone's going to come on in a few moments, and then that'll go. So the dopaminergic function system goes for the earliest possible predictor, locks onto that.
Yeah. So I actually wouldn't disagree with that. I think actually, what this might tell us is that even though joint action seems like a very social thing, in many cases, it might be a process where, you're just sort of trying to optimize somehow your own actions in a particular context. And in fact, we have a term for this that we call this a sort of me plus X way of doing things. So there are lots of joint actions you can get done by just sort of modifying your own part and not having some very detailed idea about your partner. So, as long as you sort of understand something about the contingency between your actions and some joint outcomes, you can actually get quite far. But I think there are other situations where you really have to predict the exact timing of another person's action. So, for instance, if you think about acrobats in a circus,
it wouldn't be good to be a millisecond out.
I mean, just watch one of these Cirque du Soleil movies. They're amazing, right? So you have, one of the acrobats sort of swinging, and then at the right moment in time, they go, and then they catch the other in the air. Yeah. To do that kind of thing, it could be that you need some very sort of fine-grained
in the auditory domain or in any music performance.
Music, exactly.
Or birds do this all the time. There's plenty of birds that do duets, and you can't tell there's one or two birds singing. You only when you're in the middle and you can hear one over there and one over there, you realize they've got it synchronized absolutely perfectly. And lots of courtship displays. So these things are common throughout the animal kingdom.
Yeah, and there might be some mechanisms that are very low level. For instance, entrainment. So some people think that you have, something like a sort of coupled oscillator system that lets you sort of move in synchrony with other people. And this could be completely outside of the mirror neuron system. So I think joint action is very difficult because you have so many different mechanisms that kind of work together. And I think you only have motor simulation in very particular cases, and certainly not in all cases of joint action.
Okay, I'll come to that last question in a moment, but our organizers did suggest one final topic, which is moving from mirror neurons to the whole pile of higher cognitive stuff like empathy and theory of mind, and we should try and get there later. But let's take the question from the back at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Hopefully this is just a quick question. One, I think, issue that comes up with this notion of simulation, embodied simulation, I think that the term simulation is, I think, very slippery, and I think it's really kind of abused in a lot of ways. In particular, I just wonder, because the brain is an amazing associative machine, right? And so you get some stimulus, and lots of associations are going to pop out. So you see someone start to get up and start to walk toward the refrigerator, and you've seen that kind of thing happen before, and you've learned that most people who go to the refrigerator are going to eat food. So you start activating goals and things like that. To my mind, that would not necessarily really count as any kind of simulation. I mean, it's just kind of a prediction that you're making. And you see other things like, the evidence for kind of motor theory and mirror neurons in speech comprehension, where you see, kind of activation in the lips and the throat or whatever, the tongue, when you're listening to speech. But you also get, when people are listening to spoken language, you get activation of orthographic information, which is not playing any kind of functional role in understanding speech. It's just epiphenomenal of these associations that you've built up. I mean, I see Jeff nodding, so yeah. I think we're on the same page with that. But I just wonder, basically, for people who believe in embodied simulation as an important part of social interaction, what kind of evidence should we be looking for to really support that account over just kind of a mere associative learning kind of account? It seems to be very, very difficult to kind of go that extra mile to show that these things that are being activated are really playing some kind of functional role in the interaction.
Well, can I just say something about the fridge? Just because you talked about someone going to the fridge. So I think there you would want to talk about simulation if you could show that the time you assume that it takes the person to go to the fridge is the time that you would take to go to the fridge. So I think this would be a very nice piece of evidence for simulation, and there are studies like this. So you ask people, how long does it take someone to walk up the stairs? And it really depends on how long it would take them to walk up the stairs. So I think, I would want to talk about motor simulation in these cases where you're using your own action system to generate predictions, both about, sort of the outcome of actions, but also the timing of actions. But I totally agree with you that this term of embodied simulation is very messy, because often what people mean is just some kind of sensory motor associations with more abstract concepts, right?
I want to get you back on this theory of mind. Okay, you just agree, or you can't have you agreeing.
Well, I just would like to underline just Natalie's point. Yeah, for one way of testing online embodied simulation would be to look at response times. So if it, for instance, it reflects characteristics of the thing to be simulated, it doesn't even have to be embodied. For instance, imagining how a combustion engine actually works. Yeah. So for instance, so imagining that should have some real.
We also know how long things tend to last.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how that gets us where we need to.
Well, it's the time it'll take you, or the time it'll take, say, an old man. And if the timing is more congruent with your particular execution, then one could say it's prediction coming from your own motor system. I think that's the
exactly.
view.
I'm not sure I agree with that, to be honest. So,
debate. Let's hear it.
So I was interested when you said, prediction could be purely visual or it could be purely motor. And you said that we know it's motor, for instance, because it obeys Fitts law. I'm not sure why that proves it's motor. So, for instance, every time I see someone else perform an action, reach and grasp, something like this, then the visual information also accords to Fitts law. So they reach into something big, they move faster, or smaller, they move slower. So I'm not sure that there's an association, at least for Fitts law, between the visual and the motor.
So on the Fitts law, there's actually a study where they looked at patients who are not producing Fitts law themselves. So they're only taking into account one of the dimensions, not the other one. And then if you do an observation task, they show exactly the same deficit. So there you could argue that all the time they're seeing people whose actions are obeying Fitts law, but they themselves are not producing it, and it leads to the specific deficit in observation.
But they're also seeing their own actions that don't correspond to Fitts law.
Yeah.
But if you look at the amount of
Speak up, Frank. Yeah. Sort of
One point that I thought Vittorio would probably make, which is just that we could talk about function, and function is really, I guess, slippery. But what Vittorio said was we should rethink what motor cortex does. And I think if you're going to talk about the functional organization of the brain, then I think there are some things that there are, if motor cortex is, or things that were traditionally thought to be motor cortex are doing these things, then it still is the case that we need to rethink about how we functionally organize the cortex.
One of the things that Vittorio did present us, he showed us Lemon's work on motor cortex with corticospinal neurons showing dramatic inhibition under the observation of the action. And I was intrigued by that because actually I wanted to come back to Jeff because you've got a name on paper that we've got this tendency to imitate, and we might need to stop it. We might need to not go into echopraxia, echolalia, and paradoxically, I think your paper with Marcel Bras argues that itself might lead more to a theory of mind, or maybe I'm misquoting.
No, that's right.
This, but so I'm drifting from motor cortex, which shows this inhibition during your action observation. I'm trying to get back to this. How do we get to theory of mind? Because I think there's actually quite a lot of agreement here. But the difficult questions still remain. How do we get to this sort of higher intentionality, the comprehension? We don't have Vittorio to say it's simple. You just okay, one or other. Somebody on my right.
So I think one of the attempts, and Antonia and also Justin Willems have been investigating this, is to look at autism, people who are supposed to have a lack of theory of mind, and then see the connection with the mirror system. And I think, please add on me if I'm wrong, but the evidence is not too convincing.
No, so, Jeff showed us that. The evidence is overwhelmingly complex.
It's complex, so this is like a bad starting point to make this connection. So I would say, like, apparently, it's not based on at least on the mirror neuron activation in the premotor cortex. To put it simply.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be that the crucial link between the two is self-other distinction. So we've done some follow-up studies as well, and it seems to be that, for instance, you can train people to imitate, which presumably activates the mirror neuron system, and they get no better at all at things like perspective taking. And you can train them not to imitate, and they get better at perspective taking. So the idea is that when you stop yourself imitating, you need to very clearly separate out your motor intention from someone else's motor intention. So you need to do self-other distinction. And if you think about things like false belief tasks, you have some privileged information, and the character whose shoes you're meant to step into doesn't have that privileged information. So you need to very clearly separate out the contents of your mental states from the protagonist or the character in the story's mental states. And it seems to be that the control of the mirror system and theory of mind are linked, but it's to do with self-other distinction. It doesn't seem to be due to anything about mirroring.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some other suggestions, perhaps from the Birmingham group, Appleby and Glenn Humphreys, that inhibiting the prepotent response. I mean, the prepotent response might be to copy. I don't know. There are multiple ways that one could look for the links, but I mean that would be one. And you've got to stop yourself doing the obvious thing, and then you might be able to get a more complex comprehension.
Well, we controlled for that in our particular training study. So we asked, in essence, to inhibit the Stroop response, in essence. So we asked them to inhibit a prepotent response which wasn't imitative, and inhibit a prepotent response that was imitative. And it's only when they're inhibiting imitation that they got better at perspective taking.
Okay.
So at the moment we are doing quite some autism studies in Nijmegen, and our point after my talk would not be surprising. So is that it's the lack of the connection between the conceptual areas and the sensory motor areas that's really causing the problem.
Yep.
So you always need to take the broader perspective. So it's not that far away from the weak coherence theory, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
So they are really good in sensory motor, but they're not really good in connecting to the conceptual level.
I completely agree with that, and I think Antonia does as well. I mean, we all think it's to do with the control of the system that's wrong in autism. Yeah.
So do mirror neurons say anything about theory of mind at all? Or do we all agree that they don't?
No, we don't. Not yet.
I think Antonia, you should say something about this.
I think Justin.
Yeah, I think I agree with what's been said so far. Sorry. I think I agree with what's been said so far, that mirror neuron systems don't have much to do with autism and don't have much to do with theory of mind. That's pretty clearly a separate system. There are interesting interactions between these two separate systems, but I think the majority of those interactions, or at least the ones I'm interested in, is top-down control from theory of mind onto mirror neuron systems, determining our social response, whether it's appropriate to imitate somebody or not, and things like that, rather than the idea that the mirror neuron system is providing an input to the theory of mind system. I think that it's the top-down connections that dominate.
We'll get Harold's response, and then we'll try and bring Justin. You've got a few more minutes. Yeah.
No, I would say this.
Well, all three of us want you to. Wait.
If I say that I agree.
Surely not with Jeff.
I mean, I would like to make. I mean, essentially, what we sort of argued in a 2001 paper, which a long time ago, but at the time, and it never seemed to get missed. The observations we were making was that in people with autism, they have a tendency to over-imitate. They have echolalia. They use stereotype phrases. They have echopraxia. You meet people with autism who have fantastic mimics. And it's the over-imitation and the lack of integration between the copying behavior into conceptual development and into cognitive development. And so what you see really in people with autism is a failure of sort of imitative development. So, I mean, and what we said at the time, and it was actually Rizzolatti's early paper, was an argument that there was a corticospinal inhibitory process, and it was just a very crude. There's a frontal inhibitory process of the mirror neuron system. That was always argued. And we simply said, well, and this is back in 2001, there's a lack of the modulation of the mirror neuron system. We never argued for a broken mirror. It was some other people later on who wrote a rather sort of an article in the Scientific American who introduced this idea of a broken mirror.
So we had a more recent paper actually that we tried to support basically the broken mirror. You didn't call it like that. That's absolutely a fair point, that you never called it the broken mirror hypothesis. It was Ramachandran and colleagues. But I think you had 2006, so when was it?
The original theoretical paper was back in 2001.
So, I'm thinking we're getting tired out. We promised we'd vacate the hall within about 5 minutes, so I think I'm going to draw it to close. And unless there's some other urgent question from the audience. Just summarizing, we had Vittorio getting rid of this sort of visual imperialism, and then we've had a more radical position, I think, taken perhaps. Well, actually, we heard Harold coming up with saying it's not all sort of rhetoric. I mean, it's much more conceptual, and the control over this lot. And yeah, I mean, I like and I think Jeff had a particularly hard time here, but it was great to have somebody, a provocateur, amongst us. So, I mean, I'd also like to thank Natalie for. And you're showing us, how we might learn to dance one day. I still haven't managed that, but I need to what? But yeah, and we should not forget to thank the organisers, because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for these two. So let's give a hand to these two and
to everyone. And of course to the audience, thanks very much for all the questions. So I think it's dead now, but I'm just going to speak in this one. That's fine. Thanks for coming. And there should be another buffet, so please. Yeah, there's another buffet first. But yeah. So I see. Do you see some activity in the room next door? Yeah, there are people.